All right. I have with me today Lauritz, who runs the Consciousness Development channel. It's a channel I've been following for quite a few years now. And I actually reached out to you a couple years ago to do an interview, but that fell through with just getting busy with life. But now you were kind enough to take out some time and meet with me so we can discuss a bunch of different topics, mostly centered around spirituality and spiritual practices. But Loris, would you like to say anything before we kind of jump into it?
Yeah, thank you for doing this interview with me. Um, I I don't really have anything like to say up front. I mean, I'm really happy to be here. Maybe I can just introduce myself for
Yeah.
someone who's not familiar with maybe some of the videos I've posted on my channel and my background. Yeah, I started meditation around 10 years ago, which was mainly motivated through some like secondary benefits of it, like concentration. Like I researched, I remember I researched while I was studying mechanical engineering back then. I was researching this, okay, how to concentrate better for studying or something like this. And then I kind of came to meditation and just started the habit. And at first, like just did it for these what I now or later discovered, like, okay, those are like, is not the primary purpose of a meditation practice to improve your ability to focus on your studies. And so, but that was really helpful because it was my motivation at the time to get the habit started of like a daily meditation practice. And yeah, so that I found really important. And from there, I quickly discovered, oh, this can go quite a bit deeper. There's
Mm.
more. Visited a couple of retreats, also experimented with different psychedelics, and yeah, I think we will go over all of that in the interview. But yeah, so I have, I think, I don't know, 7 years ago or something like this, I started just sharing my insights on YouTube on the channel. I started out at first like making Alan Watts quotation like videos
Mm.
and edited some of his recordings into some short little videos, but then also quickly kind of felt tired of that. So I was interested in other stuff and didn't want to like only do Alan Watts videos, and started making my own. And so that grew into the channel. Yeah, you mentioned earlier. Yeah.
I remember that time when you were making the Alan Watts clip videos, and Alan Watts was years ago a big inspiration for myself to get into meditation and to delve into it deeply. He has such a poetic and lyrical way of introducing the topics. Um, I think a lot of people were inspired by Alan Watts. I find it
Mhm.
interesting that you mentioned that you got into meditation for the cognitive benefits for studying and education. I'm actually an educator. I work at a charter school here in the States, and I work with special education students. So I'm very interested in taking whatever spiritual practices may have a beneficial cognitive effect and sharing it with the students, even if they're only using it for the purposes of improving their scholastic ability. I recently got a book. I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel P. Brown. Have you heard of him before?
No, I haven't.
He was really big in the well, I should say he was a psychologist, a psychology professor at Harvard. He recently passed away, but he was a Tibetan meditation adept. And so he wrote this book that I just showed you with a couple other authors based off of the Tibetan Elephant Path of concentration, and it's kind of pared down for younger kids. So it's about teaching
Mhm.
adolescents how to concentrate. And that's really important. I see it a lot with all the distractions that we have nowadays with social media and the such. So I want to ask you, how was your meditation practice? Did you find that with regards to improving your concentration, did you find early on that you saw really big improvements? You were able to concentrate, study more effectively?
I think I have to answer this with yes and no.
Okay.
So there are two parts to this answer, and the part where I would say yes, it did improve my concentration ability is on the pure aspect of okay, what are you doing while you are studying for something? Definitely over time you feel the effect that oh, somehow this practice kind of quiets down the intruding thoughts of other topics that may be running right now in your life.
Mm,
So what it does is really there is when you start out a very scattered mind, it's like it's jumping from one question in your head to the next and thinking about this event and another, and it the frequency with which it changes what you are thinking about kind of for me I felt slowed down a bit.
mm,
Or you could also say it made me more aware of when my mind tried to do that,
mm,
like there's my attention is not fully on that one thing, it's not one pointed really. There is like in the back of my mind kind of running a thought about what I may do when I finish studying or whatever it was at the time. It wouldn't develop into something that like pulls you off completely from the subject you wanted to study. And in that regard, yeah, meditation really helped a lot. But in my particular case, somehow I got so quickly so fascinated with spirituality and meditation practices, but also psychedelics, that it really, really deeply made me rethink my motivations for actually studying mechanical engineering.
mm,
So in that sense, it drew away a lot of energy rather not than concentration away from what I thought was meaningful at the time. So actually, I think it decreased the time that I was studying because I wanted to read so much about spirituality, about meditation, and yeah. So that is the no answer of the the no answer part of this.
that's an interesting turn of events. Can I ask you what you do professionally now?
Yeah, I still finished the degree in mechanical engineering, and since then I have been working in that area for about 5 years. But then last year I made kind of the switch from full time employment in that area to only part time work and mainly focusing now on teaching people meditation. So I'm actually, yeah, consulting mainly one on one with people who also, like you, found me through YouTube or my website. And yeah, I'm really, really happy that I have made this shift, even though it will probably never pay back financially in the same way that something more materialistic does. But that's totally fine because I see much more value in this than being an engineer. And if
Yeah.
you're not with your full heart into something, if you're not, and this is especially true for meditation, if you're not fully into it with like when you are meditating with your full being and you want to be there, then it will not bear fruit. And it was the same in my engineering work. Actually, because I wasn't in it so fully, I actually still already knew like, okay, I want to do something else eventually. It never bared the fruit that it maybe could have and never really grew into something that I was passionate about. So yeah, there's that.
Would you say a side benefit of going to more of the part-time work is also that you have more time for personal practice, or just being able to be more aware throughout the day?
Yes, very definitely. This is also very true. It was one of my motivations. Just aside from all the insights that I had already, I knew there was much more mastery in the field of meditation for me to acquire, you could say. So I
Mm,
wanted to really ramp up my practice time, which just is limited when you are gone for a job for like 10 hours a day.
mhm.
Then yeah, and also it's also to a large degree not about time but about your mental energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the evenings usually there is not much left in you after a cognitive day of work. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a 18-month-old little boy. My wife was nice enough to take him out of the house and go visit my in-laws so that I could have a quiet space to do this interview. But I can echo that sentiment. I quickly realized that my practice had to change when he came into my life. And I primarily will meditate before he wakes up and after he goes to bed because it's
Mm.
pretty difficult to do it otherwise. But I still struggle with the challenges of that lack of mental energy. You know, when you throw in the stressor of the delight, but also the stressor of having a young child, um, you really realize that your mental energy is a resource that has to be you have to be very careful how you allocate it and if you want to be able to use it effectively. So
Yes,
yeah.
yes, definitely. And also have to say, I attribute a lot of my um, progress or insights that I had to not the sitting part of the practice, where it's like, okay, you have your dedicated hour in the day where you meditate, but I attribute that more to the part where you are trying to create a certain view in your daily life, where you try
Hmm.
to cultivate a kind of contemplative state of mind throughout other activities in the day.
Hmm.
And interestingly, also that I started that practice really early on, also maybe 9 years ago, also for a different reason than spirituality. It was more because I read somewhere online that it's good for having lucid dreams. And at the
Mm.
time, I was really fascinated with lucid dreams and tried to have them as much as possible. And one way to do that is to really always kind of be aware of the state that you are in terms of am I awake or am I asleep dreaming?
Mm.
To instill the view of questioning, okay, what is this experience like? Is it dreamlike? Is it reality? Like to constantly have this question in the back of your mind, because what that does is you will keep that with you and take it with you into your dreams. We are only not aware of our dream state because we take so for granted that this is actually like wakeful state, and we never question its validity. And that's a habit that we take with us into dreams. We take it for real while we are in it. Yeah, and so that was a very powerful practice for me.
Did you find that the number of lucid dreams increased dramatically when doing that practice?
Oh, yeah, definitely, yes. But it also depends on how seriously you are actually doing it, or rather, how successful you are at implementing it, because it can be easy to forget throughout the day. I
Hmm.
worked with reminders on my phone in the beginning to really like constantly remind myself to check this, to practice actually. And it got to a point where actually I grew tired of it, because every dream I was having, it was a lucid dream. Like almost every night I had several dreams I remembered as lucid dreams, and it got to the point where it felt a little bit exhausting and too distracting. Because really, when you have so many lucid dreams, weird stuff tends to happen to your mind, where um, you play around so much with your dreams that you create very stable, like kind of second realities, where at one point I felt like, okay, I could enter the same dream reality every night and live like a parallel life, um,
Mm,
which had like really continuous aspects and solidity to it, which where characters were like having certain personalities, and like this parallel life started to kind of impede with this one, and I got a little bit scared even at times. So I kind of stopped that and tried to put a lid back on that very active and yeah, very active dream life.
that's really interesting. I have some experience myself with lucid dreaming. I don't think to the level in daily life that you did, um, but when I would go on meditation retreats, by maybe the second or third day, every single time I would lay down to sleep, I would find myself in a lucid dream. And it always was very exciting. And things would be hyper real, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, and it's always something that I wanted to cultivate for the purposes of um, kind of having that ability to work with the unconscious, perhaps do shadow work, that type of thing. Um, and I wanted to ask, did you have any experience with like wake induced lucid dreaming, the wild technique?
Hmm. Yes, that's also what I practiced for for many of the nights where I, yeah, did lucid dreaming. It's years ago, but yes, I still have very vivid memories of how that technique unfolds. And yes, I had also quite surprisingly quite some success with it, even though it's described as a more difficult technique. But somehow, as you said, like when you go to bed with the intention to keep some of your awareness alive, um, or awake rather, yeah, that really trains your concentration abilities. And actually, kind of, it felt like I intuitively know how to fall asleep and not fall asleep at the same time.
Mm,
Like
yeah.
consciously stay awake while the body falls asleep. And yeah, it's a fascinating technique because you go through these periods of um, wild hallucinations, like where you're not sure yet, am I still completely awake or is this already the dream? And then this sleep hypnagogia sets in where you're still aware of the room, but then there seems to be a real dog beside your bed barking, or like really strange sounds. And at first, it can freak you out a lot. Um, but yeah, it's also really interesting if you're just letting go and be open to whatever happens.
Lucid dreaming is a topic that I bring up with my students almost on a yearly basis. And for those students, I've always have a few that say, "Oh, I never knew what that was called, but I've had those experiences." And then there will be a few that have never had that experience. And quite often they'll come back a day or two later and say, "I had a lucid dream for the first time." So just kind of bringing that into their awareness. I know that other cultures have had um, a huge emphasis on dreaming um, as a way of divination, as a way of guidance. It really does seem like it's a huge tool to have in your toolbox. And my experience with the wild technique, as limited as it is, I noticed that a lot of the students that I work with experience similar things. And there's kind of like this stage of um, you're resting, your eyes are closed, and you can kind of feel this sensation of falling backwards.
Mhm.
Does that sound familiar with the wild? Yeah, you have this sensation of falling backwards, and then the hypnagogic imagery can start. And if you don't freak out, you can find yourself in that dream state. And a lot of people that I've talked to have gotten to that point where they feel that sensation of the body falling backwards, but then that always causes a jerk like reaction that wakes them up. Um, what What did you find that was useful for lucid, with regards to lucid dreaming, when it comes to your everyday life and then also your spiritual practice? What did you gain from that?
Um, yeah, I gained, especially for my spiritual practice, a lot of extra time.
Mm,
So at one point, I just started to use my lucid dreams in order to meditate. Or interestingly, after I had some psychedelic experiences, to take psychedelics in dreams. And the interesting thing you find is that you can actually, just by imagining to take the drug in a lucid dream, replicate the experience to an almost indistinguishable degree.
mm,
And yeah, you just dream that you pull out some magic mushrooms out of your pocket and you take them, and suddenly, like, this experience unfolds that's identical to what you experienced previously when you, like, let's say, actually took this psychedelic substance. Yeah, so I don't know if there's anything more helpful to spiritual practice if you bring with you the ability to have lucid dreams. Because as you mentioned earlier, like, lucid dreams, they are already an altered state of mind. They are kind of closer or more open and more malleable than your everyday consciousness, which is really, it feels like solid, hard, kind of difficult to actually see its structure.
mm,
Because what we are basically doing in meditation practice is trying to lay open the structure, the filters that we are all looking through at the world. And so
mm,
having some of them already removed, or actually just having the knowledge that, oh, I'm in a dream, so actually everything should be possible, that already makes you think about, okay, why is it then this way that seems so everyday like? And you start to intuitively work with ways of how to change your reality. Like, what is it like to, in a lucid dream, at first, you have to learn to go through walls. It's not easy because your mind, so from habit, creates such solidity in which is not solid, and you have to learn to let go of that created solidity and actually learn to walk through walls, or to just change your scenery instantly to anything else,
mm,
to teleport, basically, because why not? It's in a dream. And by doing that over and over again, you learn kind of intuitively how to feel into what makes your mind create these apparent solidities out of nothing. And yeah,
mm.
that's really, really helpful. So lucid dreaming is, I think, if you can work on or are interested to work on that early on, it's of great benefit to spiritual practice.
I read an article years ago about a man who used lucid dreaming to make, like, pick stocks on the stock market. And he would create a room in his lucid dream where he would enter, and there'd be a supercomputer, and he would just plug in his question, and the supercomputer would spit out an answer. And what he found was that he was very successful with his stock picks, and it almost seemed like he was plugging into the natural supercomputer of our unconscious mind. Have you found any, let's say, less than spiritual but still useful material applications for lucid dreaming?
Only in the sense that it would allow me to have time to practice certain things.
Hmm.
As I mentioned with meditation, just to try out, okay, what states of consciousness can I get into? If I, in my dream, sit down, close my eyes, and do whatever you are trying to do and develop in meditation currently. Um, but then also, I remember sometimes where I practice skateboarding. I just did
Mm,
skateboarding in my dreams, and even though I can't really, like, definitely tell it helped my real world skateboarding, it definitely felt like yeah, um, it did something. Because okay, even in the real world, what does 1 hour of skateboarding really do to your skills? Like, it's only going to do so much, and yeah, you don't have endless time in dreams also. So um, yeah.
That reminds me of a story that my now 88-year-old grandmother told me of a dream that she had when she was a child. She was attempting to learn how to twirl a baton, like a band leader would twirl a baton when they're doing like a marching band type of demonstration. And she couldn't do it while she was awake, but when she fell asleep that night, she dreamt about how to do it, and the next day she had gained that
Yeah, wow.
ability.
Yeah, that sounds
So
really like it's possible
yeah,
to do such things. But
yeah.
other like material benefits in the kind that you mentioned earlier was like kind of influencing real world life, real life events. I have to say I didn't think about that possibility. Maybe my mind was too solid in that regard because of my ontological view of like materialism and physicalism that I brought with me at the time. Yeah, but um, yeah.
I have heard of the benefits of meditating in a lucid
Mhm.
dream. Where did you find it easier to calm the mind, concentrate, gain insight along all those type of
Oh,
things?
yeah, yes, definitely. It's like sometimes even so much that you think during daily life practice, like, okay, why can I not just be in a dream right now and then start practicing? It felt to me like you are instantly in the spot. You know, it's like in real life, it's like you have to work a little bit harder to get really kind of all the ingredients together to calm the mind, to really make it quiet and open up the spaciousness. But there in dreams, it's like
Mm,
as if you have the intuition to know where you have to go with the mind and just go there. And
mm,
it's opening up huge empty black space, like pure presence, and feels like you can just go through the jhanas like instantly almost, and like go through um, very refined states very quickly. So for me personally, I have had only great experiences meditating in a dream.
So, for those of the audience that may not be familiar with the concentration states of the jhanas, these are extremely deep levels. Depending on who you ask, they range from mildly concentrated to extremely deep levels of concentration where you can be completely unaware of the physical sensations of the body, kind of completely checked out from time. Those are all possibilities with these practices in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. I want to ask you about something that often goes along with the idea of lucid dreaming or the practice of lucid dreaming, and this is considered a to some, this is considered a city in Buddhist meditation. That's astral travel or creating a mind made body. Do you have any experience with that when you were doing your lucid dreaming practices?
Um, I think I had experiences that I would interpret, or that would be interpreted by people as astral travel. But at the time when I was researching, okay, what is actually the difference? How would I tell if I'm just lucid dreaming or if I'm really astral traveling? And for me, I came to the conclusion that actually they are two different words for the same experience.
Hmm.
So it depends almost entirely on your view of the world, of what you are experiencing, which terminology or which term you put on your experience. But um, from the pure experience aspect, I would say there isn't really a difference that you can tell between lucid dreaming and astral travel, because of course in lucid dreams I traveled to like different galaxies and planets, and like had this idea of switching into different lives of other people. And as I said, I had this like kind of second life character that I was dreaming up, and really felt like, okay, I'm living this life with real people on other planets with very different flora and fauna and societies. And so there was this like, okay, aspect of, okay, I'm not this body anymore. And did I travel now really astrally to some real realm or to some dreamed up realm? I came to the conclusion that it's all just lucid dreaming. That were my,
Yeah,
yeah.
very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. I guess it would be very difficult to
Mhm.
differentiate the two.
Yeah, because what criteria do you use in order to distinguish them? And you would find that it is the view that you bring to you with the experience. It's a belief. It's not something you can find in the experience. You could say that it's not in the sensory modalities. Um, you could have two identical dreams, and one person with a certain view interprets it as a lucid dream and the other as astral travel, because it's what you believe about reality basically that makes these distinctions.
Mhm. I do know I've read some books by Robert Monroe. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Maybe, but
He
not.
wrote a lot of books on out of body travel and things along those lines. And he would do little experiments where he would like go visit friends and then report back what was going on to them at a certain time, and it would be oftentimes very
Mhm.
accurate. So it's really interesting. I think this is a good segue into talking a little bit about psychedelics. This conversation has brought up in my mind some of the work of Stanislav Grof. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with Grof? Yeah, he would talk often about um, odd experiences that he was able to induce either through the clinical use of LSD or through a method he developed with his late wife called holotropic breath work, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is basically an extended period of what looks like and probably is hyperventilation. Do you have any experience, maybe not with the psychedelic side, but with the breathwork side in inducing altered states?
Only very limited. I have tried it a few times and definitely felt my experience changing. Um, but I also have to say it was quite a time back, and I didn't do it like methodically over several sessions in order to really say anything useful to that technique. But yes, I can imagine that it works because the effects that I felt definitely were noticeable. So maybe you can tell me more about your experience if you have.
So, a few years back, I did a breathwork workshop in the Grof tradition, holotropic breathwork. What was interesting about that was, and I think that I probably bit off more than I should have at the time, was that it was a weekend where it just happened to line up that there was a ayahuasca ceremony and the breath work. So one day I did the ayahuasca, and then the next day I drove to the Bay Area to do the breath work. Um, and it was an interesting experience. My personal experience of the 3 hours of the breathwork session was that it was mostly energetic. I didn't have very many visual experiences, but it was energetic and it was very cathartic. So I felt like I had been cleaned out afterwards, psychologically, energetically. Um, the way that it's usually done is that you're paired with another person and you alternate sitting and breathing. And so the person that I was sitting for had a full visionary experience where he went to the underworld and he saw demons, but he had this feeling of security. And so he was able to kind of like laugh it off. And then he went kind of almost like the full divine comedy. He kind of went down to hell, then kind of went up to purgatory, and then went into paradise. And so he had a whole visionary experience that I didn't share. Later, I did a kind of truncated practice. It's called neurodynamic breath work. And so it's the same basic concept, but the sessions were shorter. They weren't the full 3 hours. And I think that it was about an hour and a half, maybe 90 minutes. And in that instance, I did have a visionary experience. I saw myself as some kind of antelope or gazelle running away from some predator. And just the moment when the predator caught me, I then became the predator. And so I got to feel this very interesting experience of this my life is at risk, I'm about to die, and then this joyousness of like, oh, I have food to feed my family. And so that was
Mm.
a really interesting experience. I don't know really where to place it in terms of my personal self development, but it was really interesting and it was very compelling. And I really haven't had much time to engage with the breath work since then. But I've read many of Groff's books, and he talks about some very amazing um, experiences that people report that really kind of break down, if you take them as credible, break down the materialistic paradigm in terms of people in these induced states speaking dead languages that, maybe there happened to just be a professor of this dead language who, was observing this and was like, how does this person know how to speak Sephardic, or um, there was a story that I read about a man who, how did that go? He had experience of being a priest of some sort in a castle in Spain, and then that castle being raided and him being thrown over the tower and falling to his death. And then upon further research, he found that there was a castle in Spain during this time. There was a priest that was there during that time. And there were certain aspects of the experience that he had that matched up perfectly with the historical account. So I know that there are a lot of instances like that when people get into these altered states of consciousness. Um, so yeah, it's a very rich area. I hope that more research is done in that area. I actually reach out to Groff maybe a couple of years ago to try to do an interview, but he had just had a stroke, so he wasn't physically able to engage with that. So,
Mhm.
but it's very interesting fertile area.
Yeah, this what you were just saying brought to my mind some aspect of the spiritual path, which is interesting because when I came to it, and I think many people who come to this have similar inclinations, is with the idea of wanting to know it all,
Mm-hmm.
wanting to know how is reality? Is it really like this, or is it more like this? What is the self? Do we have free will? Is it material? Are atoms real? Is it all made up of stuff? Did the universe explode in a big bang and we are the result of it? All of these questions, because I was really scientifically minded and had all of these interests in physics, of course, but also in mathematics. And I discovered paradoxically through this work um, that in a sense, that you can never answer them.
Mm-hmm.
But not because maybe in a certain way you couldn't. Maybe there are answers to these questions. Are these experiences real? Do they point to something? But it's more in the sense of the answer or the question even becomes nonsensical to you
Mm-hmm.
because you don't need it anymore. It's because you see the motivation for asking these questions. Once you discover, okay, why did I have these questions? And now kind of they have fallen away, they are not a problem anymore. And there you discover it was because you didn't feel your intuition and your feelings about these topics. that's what drove you to find answers. And I think this comes back to one of the recent videos that I posted about how to really become happy through meditation and to enjoy the practice of it. Because the more you enjoy your state of being, the more unified it is. And if it's when it's fully unified and you're aware of this unity rising as you or God or this consciousness, whatever term you want to use, um, then there is obviously nothing left out. There's no empty space to fill. It's all full. There isn't only in conception that there is the idea created that there is an answer missing here, that there is an empty space to fill.
Hmm.
It only happens in the conceptual mind. And once you transcend that, on another level, all of these questions don't are not necessary anymore. Maybe they are interesting pastimes, but on a deeper level, you know that they cannot be answered in the way you hoped when you started out the inquiry.
You could say further too that even if they were answered, they wouldn't give you the satisfaction that you were
Exactly,
hoping
because
for.
yeah,
Yeah.
because what would the answer be? It would just be a sound, it would be a thought. You could write it down, maybe you could make a formula out of it. But at the end of the day, that's something you see, hear, feel, taste, or touch. You know, it's
You know, I kind of felt similar about my experience with psychedelics, in that I would have these big experiences, and I wanted to dive deeper into them. And more recently, I've kind of grown. There's grown a disinterest in me towards these larger experiences. I must say, though, I saw the video that you the most recent video that you did with Frank Yang talking about the benefits to the psychedelics on the spiritual path. And it kind of reinvigorated a little bit of an interest. I don't think that I'm in the place at this point in my life to do that, the exploration in the way that I'd like to, or the integration the way that I'd like to. But it has given me some inclination to re-explore that aspect. There was a time where I had a lot of experience with psychedelics. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how the psychedelics have been beneficial for you, what your initial experiences were, and how that informed you going forward.
yeah. Um, so I started, or the first trips I also had towards the end of my studies. So I was maybe 23 at the time, so they're like 7 years ago, and the experiences were very mixed, as psychedelic trips tend to be. So there were a couple of at the time very pleasant trips, but then they were also followed up by a certain really unpleasant experiences. Um, and I have to say, I didn't understand that at the time, but now looking back, they really loosened my grip on this reality to a degree that actually brought me to the point where I was able to consider some of the spiritual teachings as potentially truthful.
Hmm.
So they showed me things that had definitely had the benefit of shaking up this already kind of very solid view that I had developed through like studying physics and mathematics and thinking about the universe in dualistic terms of okay, materialistic and science, that's the foundation of our world, and it will find the answers in a particular way, and I was used to that way. And psychedelics quickly showed me that that's very limited.
Hmm.
And so they actually planted the seed, you could say, of curiosity in me, of saying, okay, there is something that lies outside of what I can explain, of what I can research and understand through that certain lens of physicality, of materialism. And in that sense, I'm really, really thankful for what psychedelics did to me. But down the road, the years that came, they actually didn't play that much of a role for me. They
Hmm.
definitely didn't help in great ways of training my concentration, of training to learn what the mind is actually doing in different states of consciousness, and learning to play and manipulate that and actually know all the ingredients of joy, of all of these different states of mind, and what pain is, learning to deal with that. And um, that is really where I see meditation is invaluable and cannot easily or simply, maybe it can, but not very obviously, simply be replaced by just taking something and um, not having a certain approach. Because I think there is a lot of potential in psychedelics, but there also you need to know how to work with them. It's not
Hmm.
just you take it and then boom, your life is completely improved from that point onwards.
Yeah.
It takes also an approach. But maybe you can share some of your experiences as well, because you said you had quite some different kind of experiences.
Um, I um, I, I will be happy to talk about that. I just want to clarify: you're in a Nordic country? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in Germany, right?
Oh, okay. And what are the laws surrounding psychedelics there? Is there? I know that in the Netherlands there's some legality. How is it in Germany?
Yeah, it's not legal. I think there was a time, yes, or it's still possible to get some variants of LSD that are legal, like some altered versions of it, like 1 CP LSD,
Hmm.
but they will probably be banned soon as well, I've heard. So yeah, it's mostly illegal. But as I'm living close to the Netherlands, it's easy to just go there for a couple of days and have it legally, or just yeah, source it from there, let's say.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. Where the laws are loosening up in a lot of places in the United States. I know that in Oakland, I think almost all forms of psychedelics, which is in the Bay Area, almost all forms of psychedelics have been legalized on the city level. So that just means, I guess I shouldn't say legalized, maybe decriminalized, meaning that they won't pursue criminal charges or anything, and personal use is not frowned upon, at least from the law, and a few other places as well. But my own personal experience, I would say the first time I did any psychedelic, I did a very high dose of LSD, and I think what I pulled away from that experience was simply that. Um, I could hold two contradictory experiences in my awareness at the same time. Um, and also just this idea that there's a lot more to the world that we don't usually experience for whatever reason. In my own conception of it, from what I understood from the research that I've done, it seems like the default mode network, which I like to think of as like the neurological instantiation of the ego, is basically a filter that removes certain parts of our experience so that we can function in a survival context. And so it opened my eyes to the possibility, like, hey, we're kind of living in an illusion, or at least a greatly truncated experience of the world, and there's more out there, and if we can kind of start to get out of our own way, we can start to experience those things. I had another really large experience with psilocybin mushrooms, and the takeaway from that was not so much spiritual as I, it kind of like borderlines the spiritual and material. I remember looking around my bedroom and seeing all of my stuff and thinking, okay, I've got one of those, one of those, one of those. Okay, I'm like a good human being, right? Like I've got all the necessary human being things. And reflecting on that, I realized it really broke my attachment to material things. I was like, I don't need any of this. And I became quite a minimalist after that. I mean, I slept on the floor for years, had very minimal things besides books. My friends would call me eccentric, but I think that that really was one of the things that really changed my behavior, um, and how I approached life in general. So not so much spiritual practices, but just life. And I'm trying to think. It's been so many years now. Um, I feel like I kept on going back to the psychedelics to try to have some of those experiences that I would read other people talk about. And I did have experiences of, seeing the light, or, an infinite void of space, um, things along those lines that may line up more with what we consider traditional spiritual experiences. But I think that you echoed this a little bit, that I kind of grew a little bit weary of the experiences. And maybe that's because of the way that I was coming at it, that I was seeking something instead of just allowing these experiences to occur. Um, uh, I think that, and I've told this to many people, that one of the things that I liked so much about psychedelics was not so much the experience, but the afterglow, and how my mind was so open, spacious, and quiet, and how I just really enjoyed living in that
Mhm.
space. You know, I could just sit quietly, be with my body, and be very content.
Mm.
Um, so that was something that I really enjoyed with psychedelics, and that I could see as something that I was also accessing through my spiritual practices. I don't know. Maybe you can comment on that if that brought anything to mind, or.
Yes, indeed. There is something or one perspective that I would like to share, from which maybe to understand what you just uh, laid out. And this is, I think it's an analogy that's often used in spiritual teachings. It's if you imagine the mind as like the surface of a lake, of water, and you could now imagine, or also the listeners vision in your inner mind when you are sitting besides a lake, and there's actually it's surrounded by trees, and there's one scenario where it's sunny, but there's also a lot of wind, and you would look on that lake on the surface and you couldn't see anything of the trees that are actually reflected on the other side of the lake.
Mm,
So when you are letting the mind settle in meditation, those trees on the other side of the lake, they become clearer and clearer. And then there will be the point where there are only like slight ripples on the surface of the water. And you can almost see what is reflected. You could almost like have a clear picture of it. But then there is like almost a magnitude of difference between some ripples and a perfectly clear, still
mm,
surface. Where imagine you can see the trees reflected so clearly that you can see the individual leaves and everything on that water. It's perfect. And this is kind of like how the mind feels eventually through meditation. It's complete
mm,
peacefulness. And I think what you just described, that meditation, that psychedelics put you in that state where afterwards you feel like, somehow there's space. There is like because what I think what you mean by space, if I relate that to my experience, is a sensation of everything is okay, it's open, it's not constricted, it's
Hmm.
harmonious. And so there is, yeah, as you just said, it feels spacious. You're not so constricted by all of these concepts in your mind. The veil is, so to speak, lifted for a while, and this feels very pleasant. And so one way to describe meditation experiences or psychedelic experiences is in terms of how the frequencies in our mind gets harmonized, so that everything is eventually like vibrating in the same frequency, which feels very nice. It's so peaceful. It's very peaceful, and that's also one of the approaches, um, or things you can bring with you in your practice, is asking, how can I make this experience right now more homogeneously, maybe vibrating in the same frequency? There are different ways to think about this or to visualize it, because that's also like some way to understand the jhanas. For example, the progression through the jhanas is, okay, how can I make this whole space of awareness come through as one thing, so that it is just wholeness without any dividing lines in between, or in the experience, in between the senses. Like there are differences. You distinguish the sense of the body from the hearing, from the feeling, and through the jhanas you want to unify all of that into one spacious, open, crystal clear reflection of yeah, what you eventually see then reflected as your true nature in there.
Yeah, the experience of deep concentration, and I'm cautious to use the term jhana, because depending on the tradition, there's different standards. But the experience of the mind in deep concentration and even afterwards is very similar to that afterglow of psychedelics, and it's just this openness, this acceptingness. And one of the insights that I had of the mind and concepts and thought was that they're all very contractile in nature.
Mm,
To have a thought, you kind of have to like impinge on the mind. There's a certain level of tension
mm,
there to even have a thought. And I got into this with the last interview I did with Stefan Snyder, and he confirmed a lot of these experiences that I was having. But it does seem like you can do this at any time. You can do this walking down the street and just be aware of your mind and the contractions and the tension in your mind. And especially with the aid of your breath and the exhale, you can let go of some of these things. I I it just makes me think about a day that I had where for whatever reason I was super in the flow and I was just with my mind and with my breath throughout the entire day. And every single time I would take an exhale, it was like a rush of euphoria through my body. And I kind of had this little smirk on my face when I was interacting with other people, thinking, like, you have no idea how pleasant it is for me right now, just having this somewhat banal conversation with you. I've never really been able to replicate that to that level, but it showed me that, and I think that there's some science to back this up, that the default of the mind is kind of
mm,
joyous and happy, but we overlay on top of it all of these tensions, contractions, concepts, emotions, feelings that really take away from this bright, luminous, spacious, open mind that is just inherently joyful.
mm.
Um, Maybe we can talk a little bit about concentration practice, since that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah. What you just said triggered a certain thought within me, which is something that took me quite some years to understand, even though I think I heard it beforehand, but it's not so easy to understand for someone who just gets into meditation. And that's it's related to concentration practices, which is how do you actually create that um, view on your experience that you just mentioned, where it's more inclusive, where it's more open, more wide, more accepting. And in a sense, that's not very different from what you're doing in meditation. It took me
Mm,
some years to learn how to actually concentrate in a very deep, meaningful way, not in the way that you usually do it on tasks in everyday life, where we are so trained to think about concentration as something exclusive. It's okay, I want to concentrate on this thing, and in order to do that, I have to exclude a lot of other stuff. So
hmm
the approach that the beginner is going to take in meditation is trying to exclude. It's going to try to push away distractions, to just concentrate on the breath, for example.
hmm
But actually, concentration, successful, like jhana like concentration, is achieved through inclusion. So you have to kind
mm
of make the breath or make everything of your awareness be included in the breathing. So that's like your whole being, you're breathing with your whole being. So that finally there is nothing excluded anymore from that breathing. You know, everything is in
Yeah.
that state happening kind of as the breath, like the distinctions fall away. That's what like true concentration could be conceptualized, I think, more appropriately for meditation purposes.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I can say that in my own personal practice, cultivating concentration, one of the things that I've found very useful recently is almost viewing the breath as a black hole that any other sensation that comes in just gets sucked into it. It becomes part of it. Um, but I've also found in the past that, and this is just to speak on this idea of not pushing things away, is that the mind has a natural tendency to settle if you leave it to its own devices. The problem is that we continually kind of mess and fidget with
Mm.
things. I like to use the analogy of like taking a handful of flour and throwing it up into the air. And then if you just watch the little particles of flour settle, the air becomes clear and pure. But what we tend to do is we tend to fan it around by saying, I don't want this, and I don't want this experience. I want this experience. Am I doing this well enough? And I've often thought that a lot of these subtle aspects of meditation aren't talked about in a lot of books. A lot of books, especially on concentration, they just say, focus your attention here or focus your attention on the belly. And whenever something comes up, just return your attention there. And to a large extent, that's true and it does work, but it can be extremely frustrating for the
Mm.
beginner. And so I've kind of developed a softer way of working with distractions. I think that having the insight that you're not your mind and your body and that you can observe those things without being identified with them is huge. I think that the loving kindness practices, even if you haven't done them formally, but if you have a disposition of kindness and gentleness towards distractions in your meditation, that is often very helpful as well. Like if you have a thought come up, instead of admonishing yourself because you didn't stay focused on the object of concentration. Instead, you look at the thought with gentleness, with kindness, kind of giving it its due. Like it arose, the kind of the way to think about this is it arose because it wanted your attention. And if you just give it some loving attention, it'll go on its way. And so, that is one way that I found that it's very useful to get the mind concentrated. And um, there is this level of observing the subtle there's like kind of like two stages. There's a point where the verbalization kind of stops, but there's still like a fluctuation of the mind, and you can see like, oh, if my mindfulness gets a little bit weak here, um, thoughts are going to start coming back up. So you kind of have this aspect of being gentle with the thoughts and the emotions and the mental formations, and then as those calm down and they aren't like explicitly being um, they aren't explicitly arising in the mind, then you can kind of look at the surface of the mind and see this gentle vacillation of the mind, and just being with that calms down. And there's a distinct shift from the mind, and I'm having thoughts, to I'm no longer having thoughts but the mind is still moving, and then that next shift to the mind has basically stilled is tremendous. It's just like, that's when the mind just opens up and becomes spacious, and it just seems like so much more is
Yeah.
possible with a mind that's like that.
Yeah,
So those are
yeah,
my thoughts on that.
really well explained. And what it feels like to have these shifts in concentration is, as with the example earlier, is like it feels more peaceful in a very, very, um, in a way that's not really well described by joy or happiness, but something better.
Mm-hmm.
Something
Yeah.
something that's of a different order. It's because what you discover also with increased experience in meditation is that happiness or joy, what we usually understand by this, it's actually still an agitated state. It's still like
Yeah.
somehow not quite right. It's still, there are
Yeah.
aspects in it that are somehow dissonant. It doesn't feel completely right. Um,
Yeah.
but that will only become obvious down the line for most people. But it's still a point that you just described very interestingly, where when it all stills down, um, it's a different kind of experience. It's really like you shifted the operating system, so to speak. Because for like really profound states of stillness and concentration, even the sense of self has to go. It's something that
Yeah.
you are
Hmm.
generating. And if you still generate that this thing over there is perceived by something over here in the mind, and then there is some level of agitation, something that is creating that sense of self, which is actually on a very fine, deep level, a distraction from the thing. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's just
Yeah.
what came up to mind when you were explaining your experience.
Definitely, definitely. Um, the traditional term for joy in this meditation is piti, and it took me a long time to associate my experience with that term, because it really does kind of feel like an intense version of being a child on Christmas morning. Right? It's like this almost like energetic vibration. You're like so
Mm.
excited. Um, when I was on a retreat some years ago, and I would say that this is something that I experienced previously, is having this PT, this energetic feeling in the body being so intense that it's literally like throwing me out of my seat. And some of the traditional texts talk about that you kind of have to manage the PT to a certain extent. You can have joy that's too great for concentration. Um, and I had an experience on a retreat that was quite disturbing and scary to me. I related this in the previous podcast of feeling this intense PT after maybe about 90 minutes of sitting. Um, I was actually laying down at this time and feeling this intense PT go through my body, like, um, The best way that I can kind of describe it is as a sound effect, like brum, brum, kind of like this sensation coming up and moving through my body. And then the PT intensified to such a degree that the best analogy that I can describe it is it's almost if, and I'm kind of showing my nerdiness here. It's almost if somebody strapped you onto the front of like the Starship Enterprise and they're like, okay, Picard's like, let's go warp 10. And it just felt like I was being disintegrated into white light. And so this is somewhat similar to the wake induced lucid dreaming, where there's this sense of lack of control, and that can be very scary with regards to the concentration meditation. Now, this is from talking with Steven Snyder. This is probably a more absorptive and deep concentration, and some jhanas or some teachers would not need this standard for it to be a concentration or jhana state. But maybe that's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the depth of concentration with the more deep forms of concentration. There is often a lack of awareness of the body, a lack of awareness of sounds, a lack of awareness of time, and it's often accompanied with the seeing of a bright light, which is called the nimitta. Do you have any experience or any comments in that sphere, in that area?
Yeah. So for one, there are always different ingredients to your state of experience right now. To whatever experience you're having, it's always mixed. There's nothing
Mm,
that you can point to and say, that's my experience right now. Usually there's a lot of things going on in one moment of experience, in one moment of consciousness. And when you take out of this wholeness of experience the sense of self, it usually already means that one big distraction or disharmony is already removed. So, with the earlier analogy of the pond, of the lake surface, there is like one source of ripples removed, maybe water drops falling into it. Like the sense of self, you could say, is one center where like waves are forming from, is already removed. But that alone doesn't guarantee you that you have a smooth experience. There could be still other things disturbing the complete smoothness of the experience. And so, even before you lose the sense of self, many people experience through many years of meditation practice that they actually remove certain um, triggers that are disturbing the still mind, so to speak, and yet still have a sense of self. And for many people, that's kind of one of the last things to go. And in that regard, I can understand why some people have different degrees of describing the jhanas, because some people say, okay, it's a matter of degree. When you have removed these and these obstacles, or these and these things are present, that's jhana so and so. And certain other people have more strict kind of lists of ingredients that you have to fulfill in order to call this their jhanic experience. Um, but yes, removing the sense of self and then seeing, okay, whatever is left, how do I refine that? That is
mm.
like, I would say, where true jhanic work is starting, and can also take you even all the way through all of the jhanas, through cessation, um, and yeah, finally, the goal of the path.
Do you find that retreat time is necessary for that depth of concentration?
Yes, in my own experience, and also for many other people. Yet, as we have said in the beginning, for me, example, right now, I'm not yet having kids, maybe in the future, but um, I'm working only part time. I'm teaching this, and I have a lot of time to practice myself. Many days it's about 4 hours a day. I can feel this is doing a lot to develop these different abilities to switch between the jhanas and have these deeper insights related to aspects of certain jhanas, and how to navigate them. Um, but when I first came to it, it always were only the extended periods of retreats that really opened up these new levels, kind of, or these new abilities for me, or new realms even. I wouldn't call it abilities, because you get into it on one retreat, but you kind of don't really know what you had to bring with you to get there. But it at least opened up in the mind the possibility to go to such places. And yeah, because for many people at first, before entering any jhana, it's a lot of doubt. It's like, yeah, people are talking about this, even though they may believe them, but they doubt, can I do this? Maybe I'm just
Mhm.
not um, blessed enough with like mental abilities in order to pull this off. And I know a lot of doubt is coming in, and really, in order to shatter that, you need a good, at least 10-day, or even better, 14-day retreat where you can basically practice this the whole day, and then you can enter jhana and yeah, re- um, remove your doubts that you are still carrying in your mind.
Yeah, that's huge, and it's even now. I wouldn't say that I'm an adept in this type of meditation, but I've had my handful of experiences, and even now I still struggle with. Can I do this again? Was that just a fluke?
Mm,
Um, you know, but getting past, I've come to the conclusion that any depth of concentration is better than no concentration,
mm,
and even if you can just quiet your mind so that there's less chatter in your mind, that's of great benefit.
mm,
It really is. And maybe to double back to what we were talking about in the very beginning, in terms of the more materialistic and practical uses of some of these states of concentration, is that if you can quiet your mind, it's almost like when your mind is noisy, it's inefficient and it runs dirty. And so when you can quiet your mind, it's almost as if you can ask it to do something and it facilitates itself. So if I like to do a lot of creative work, I like to draw, I like to paint, um, and if my mind is really busy, it's really bogged down, it's really tired, it's somewhat laborious to come up with an image and have it look the way I want. But if my mind is quiet and calm and energized as well, I can just simply request something of my mind. And it's almost like, for example, if I'm trying to draw something, I can see it projected onto the page and I just need to then copy what I see. So the mind is just so much more malleable and useful in that way. So,
yeah, definitely is my experience as well. I have one thing that I want to say in regard to this, which is, when you have repeatedly entered like very refined states of concentration, you kind of develop the sense to be able to pick those qualities up in your everyday experience. So you could go through what would be regarded by many people tragic life events, or some just bad days, or very stressful situations. But when you have experience with meditation, you have access to certain parts of your experience that you hadn't before. And the more experience you get, the more this stillness or this peacefulness can be accessible in every situation, until finally, with like very advanced stages, it kind of becomes prominent, so prominent in your experience that it's actually what you see mostly, so that you have a
mm,
jhanic state available all the time, because that's what you have trained your mind to perceive. It's the peacefulness that is underneath everything. that unification where all of these differences that you usually perceive are just projections on top of that. And in that way, it feels very good. For one, it's just
Mm,
where you, if you could choose a state of mind, you would just choose that. But in one way, you're also very functional, and it is just um, so beautiful to see that coming from the practice, being able to still engage in the practice in order to deepen it, because always being in this conversation right now, engaged with the world, there is a certain type of friction which you have to just experience in order to make the distinctions to live. But when you then go and you keep this presence and you go into your meditation practice, it can bloom very quickly again into like, oh, you still have it with you. You remained mindful throughout the day between the sessions, and it's still there when you go to the cushion and meditate again. It's like, I just have to grow that which I carried with me since last session, this peacefulness, this aspect. And yeah, it can just blossom so quickly again when you practice. And then that's really what I wanted to say. It's about controlling the mind between sessions, because you said like the minds can really, if you have these thoughts, it creates negative energies and just leaves bad imprints in your mind that you then have to work out in your next session before you can even get to concentration. And so keeping mindful throughout the day is really, really important if you have only limited amount, like let's say 1 or 2 hours a day to practice.
mhm. Yeah, that's a very good tip, and it's something that I've really tried to do more and more. But like you said, maybe I need to start doing the phone reminders, which is something that I have done in the past. Just set an alarm for every hour just to remind myself to be more mindful. But one of the things that I really try to do is stay grounded and anchored in my body and the physical sensations of my body, because that allows me to know like when I'm pushing too hard, maybe when I'm getting anxious, things along those lines. And um, in the past, especially when I've been trying to develop certain levels of concentration, I noticed that, hey, if I meditate 3 or 4 times throughout the day, then I can see some momentum building. But if I'm only meditating once or twice a day, maybe I stay where I am, but I'm not really seeing a lot of progress in terms of the depth of my concentration. But I definitely want to integrate more of this level of awareness throughout the day. I remember kind of coming to the conclusion and awareness that, hey, you're basically supposed to meditate all the time. At first, it was like, oh, that seems so exhaustive. But
Mm.
you really do want to develop this ability to just be aware at all times throughout your life and throughout the day. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, you could think of this in terms of we are all kind of all going down a certain stream of experience, and this stream that we are going down, it has a certain momentum to it. And what we are trying to do is, with meditation, kind of switch streams. So at first, whenever you engage in a new practice, and especially with meditation and daily mindfulness, you have to employ first a lot of effort to switch the stream,
Hmm.
kind of from your default mode of perceiving things, of dividing them up, of just spending most activities in the mind. That's where most people have their center of attention. It's like
Hmm.
they cook, they clean, they go to work, they are at work at certain tasks, but they are actually in the mind of imagining stuff somewhere else. And breaking that habit, switching streams to presence, mindfulness, stillness, calmness, seeing that underneath the experiences, that takes a lot of effort at first. And yes, there's probably no way around this. Setting timers, maybe establishing the habit of always feeling the body, its posture. At first, maybe starting to be mindful only when you're walking somewhere, I found that works well. If you say, just say, okay, whenever I go um, in my house or to work, when I go to the train or to my car, every step that you do basically, it's a reminder of, okay, let me feel my feet, establish this habit of presence, of mindfulness. Um, yeah, and it can help greatly to reduce that increase in friction between sessions, and then you can go into the session more present already, and it's easier. It's not that you have first to spend 20 minutes like working through your stuff and going into the mode that you have to go into, and then yeah, usually it goes a little bit smoother.
That I'm glad that you articulated that. And like I said, it was something that I've been trying to do, but I feel now that I am going to put a reinvigorated effort into that, because I do see that. And with the busyness of my day, you're absolutely right. I have to spend the first 15 or 20 minutes kind of fixing myself energetically before I can even really attempt to focus in on one thing or be extremely present. So that's something really that's a very good that's a very good tip.
Yeah, and what it also does, it will create a certain state of mind in which you're actually more productive in the usual sense.
Hmm.
Um, because just reflecting back, and everybody can do that with their own experiences, when are you doing your best work? Is it when you are feeling tired, sluggish, out of energy, or maybe in a bad mood or depressed? Usually not. So you do the best work when you're actually in it, when you're in the flow, when you are really feeling like, okay, this is what I want to do. And this is showing when you are in the moment, when you are completely aligned with what you're doing, you have more energy, you feel better, and you definitely want to be more engaged.
Yeah.
And so, just feeling and training your mind to be on the moment definitely makes you feel better. And therefore, you could also say, as a ego-based um, motivation, it will make you more productive in a sense, even though you're not outcome focused anymore. But yeah.
That's very interesting. That's a very good point. I think that it would be, I don't know how much time that you have. You've been kind enough to be with me for about 90 minutes here, but I would like to touch on some of the insight practices. And we've been focusing on concentration. We've talked about lucid dreaming. We've talked a little bit about psychedelics. Um, Insight practice is, I would say, an area that I don't think that I've given enough attention to. I've
Mm.
had insights, um, but I think for a long time I was chasing those concentration states, which
Hmm.
can be a distraction, can be dangerous if you don't give enough due to the insight practices. And I've read, and I think that you've talked about this as well, Daniel Ingram's Mastering the Core Teaching of the Buddha, which really lays out at least his interpretation of the path and the progress of insight. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. That could spark a little bit of discussion, and we can go from there.
Yeah. There are, in one way, there are two schools out there when it comes to insight or concentration. So, on the one hand, some people are saying concentrate first in your practice on the ability to concentrate, to have a certain level of stability in your in your awareness, to really train the mind to become one pointed.
Hmm.
And then there are others who are saying, okay, just go to insight practices. Just go look at the thing directly. Look at the breath, look at the sensations. Just do that, practice insight. So that would be vipassana. The other would focus mainly on shamatha. But it's not, those would be like two extremes. But usually you could understand this, and I think that's more helpful for practice to understand this as a spectrum.
Hmm.
So, what concentration usually does, it increases your ability to actually observe reality. So all that we discussed earlier, the refinements, the jhanic states, the refinements of your concentration, you are actually researching, understanding what ingredients you need in order to observe reality.
Mm,
So, in a sense, you could say you need both. You need concentration and you need the ability to actually look at reality, or to have insights. And in practice, you have to play a little bit with, okay, how much should I tend towards just unification of mind, oneness, to how good I feel, improve my ability to concentrate, and then use those abilities that you develop on that side to actually look at the sensations arising in the moment. Because, and this is important to understand, you can do concentration both on something more conceptual and something that is actually a sensation arising and passing in the moment.
mm,
So for pure shamatha, you would use a concept. You would actually, even if you're doing breath awareness, you would let the breath become concept like, something very stable, very smooth, something continuous. You create that actually by the way you are practicing. And this would be pure shamatha, but then you can also use one pointedness, concentration, and look at sensations arising and passing very quickly, which is you have to first kind of feel into that, what that means. It's not easy to understand what's the difference between a conceptual breath and you also feel concentrated on it. If someone really would ask you, okay, are you concentrated on the breath? You would still answer yes. And actually, not really, in a sense. And then there is the concentration on the actual sensations. Um, and yeah, that's something you, with experience, you will work out the difference there, mainly through seeing the impermanence of things that's inside. And when it feels very smooth and continuous, that's shamatha. So, yeah.
um, in my experience with the working with the breath, you kind of go through a stage where you're seeing the different aspects of the breath, where it's the inhale, the exhale, the beginning of the inhale, the end of the exhale, the end of the inhale, beginning of the exhale, the end of the exhale, the middle regions. And it seems like if you continue in that direction, just kind of breaking the breath down, that it becomes more of like an insight practice where you're looking at the little tiny components and sensations of that experience. Um, and that's very useful, I've found, to establish concentration because it gives your mind something to do. Whereas if you try to jump into the concentration and just look at the breath, but you don't look at its individual parts, it's very easy for the mind to run away in those interval periods. You can be with each breath, but in between, let's say the beginning of the inhale and the end of the exhale, your mind may wander and then come back and then wander and come back. So staying with all those little sensations really helps to build the concentration. But at some point, especially when you emphasize letting go, being peaceful, um, the breath coheres to when where it becomes so subtle that you don't really perceive the in and the out. You just kind of perceive a sensation almost like a touch, like it's just touching that area. And then over time, that physical sensation starts to take on visual aspects. And around that point, at least in my own practice, that's when the nimitta, or that bright light, will start to make its appearance. And that does seem very conceptual. It doesn't seem like it's of a material or sensate nature.
Mm.
Um, so if we continue this practice of breaking things down, if we're more on the other extreme of the continuum of insight and shamatha, um, what occurs? What happens if we just stay with those raw sensations
Mm.
in your experience?
Yeah, usually if you just practice insight, if you just do vipassana, then there is the tendency for the reality to break up so that you are actually seeing the impermanence of it. If you become very kind of present, you see that it's actually arising and passing super fast, super quickly. The sensations are very short until you actually see that, wait a second, if they are arising and passing so quickly, it seems like they are just arising and passing in no time. Like they are already passing the moment they are arising.
Mm,
And it can, the ripple down effects of that, if you go down that road exclusively, is that it actually doesn't feel very nice to go through that. Um, the insight is very much restructuring the way you view yourself in a certain particular type of way. And proponents of this way, they usually say, okay, this is the real way to see reality. This is how it is, how you go through this whole spiritual process. But in my experience, it depends really much on how you look at reality. You could even in one session quickly, not very quickly, but in one session, switch from a pure vipassana view where you see the impermanence to a pure shamatha view where you actually perceive it as a continuous oneness. So
hmm
you see, like if you do that over and over again and you play with the different views and you see that it's malleable, um, it actually produces another type of insight, which is the emptiness of everything. It's not one way or the other. It comes with a certain view. It's dependent on that. And so this pure vipassana view, it kind of, to me, it feels like it lacks a little bit of this warmness, this heart centered centeredness that usually is required when you do shamatha practice. As we
mm
talked earlier, it's very pleasant, very joyful, very peaceful, and um, that's more characteristic of shamatha. Whereas vipassana can feel all over the place depending on how you're structured, maybe what you bring with you, the expectations, um, and also involuntarily maybe bringing in certain types of vipassana, of shamatha aspects to the practice, even though you think maybe you are doing vipassana. There's, as I said, it's a spectrum. So, um, yeah, it
That
definitely feels better to go through shamatha first. But as you, I think, mentioned before, it can have the downside of getting stuck there and
yeah.
not going further.
That the two thoughts came up. I don't know if you've ever seen. Sometimes they have like these laser displays where they'll have a laser moving extremely fast, and that'll create an image.
Mm.
I don't know if you've ever seen this before. Um, it in my experience when doing some type of insight practice and my mind gets really fast, it's kind of a realization that the solidity of my experience is just made up of all of these sensations that are moving very quickly and give the illusion of solidity. Is that, am I going in the right direction with
Yes,
in
yes.
terms of Vipassana?
And it's also what creates this sense of separateness. So, oh, this one thing is something fundamentally different from another thing. It's actually because
hmm
you don't see that it is just individual sensations arising and passing very quickly, but kind of at different times, even though they are like maybe um, switching back and forth very quickly, but you don't see that it blends into something, usually into this one experience where it feels like, okay, this one thing is really outside of whatever you're experiencing right now, even though it's maybe just created conceptually, um, but for just very short flickering moments that you don't see clearly. And this is what you're trying to see with Vipassana.
So if we stay with that experience of the flickering of sensations, and this solidity created by um, not being mindful enough, right? Um, it can lead to this sensation you had mentioned earlier of not, it's not, it doesn't feel very good. And I believe this is called disillusion.
Hmm.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So, for those who are not aware of the progress of insight, by doing this practice of paying attention to your raw sensations, this raw sensations, you have a few insights that lead up to kind of like a spiritual high.
Hmm.
This is called the arising and passing away. And then directly after the spiritual high is kind of a spiritual low, sometimes referred to as a dark night. And this can be the difficult and challenging aspects of a spiritual practice. So you have this experience of everything falling away, this dissolution, and what are some of the things that can happen after that?
Yeah, one thing to that is, I think a lot of expectations play into the experience of the Dark Knight. So
Mm.
yes, it's mentioned also in many like Western Buddhist circles nowadays, but I think it's dependent on the way you bring in a certain expectation with you to that experience. It kind of solidifies if you expect that this is a thing, that this is something that you may get stuck in now, that you have to really struggle to get over. And one thing to learn from that is how important expectations are in this work in general. Because I think the Dark Knight really is something that the sense of self attaches to when it feels, oh, there is dissonant energy manifesting. It creates a story around that in order to, like, okay, it feels like the old part, the old way to identify these things have been discovered to be groundless. So it cannot be this basis of the self anymore. So it creates another blind spot, so to say, where it's like something you don't really want to look at, which it usually is, these negative sensations. And it creates a story around, oh, you are in the dark night now. And so just for people to be aware, not to solidify any ideas around that. Um, but yeah, sorry, I just this is just something that came to mind. What was your question again?
I was just asking, and I think that that's a really good point. And I'll actually return to my question in just a second, but just to give a personal example of what you were just talking about, I, I'm not sure because I don't have all the experience in this area, but if I had to guess, I would think that at some point in the past, I passed the rising and passing away, and I've noticed in my own practice for years these periods of the mind is just foggy, or the mind is difficult to work with, or and it seems to happen cyclically. Um, so but one of the things that I've realized is the faster that I can realize that that's where my mind is and stop fighting it,
Mhm.
the faster it resolves, the
Mhm.
faster it kind of takes care of itself. Is that kind of going in the direction which you were speaking?
Yes, because usually what I meant by there are new blind spots created is exactly this. When you are again just mindful and present with what is, the practice goes in the direction of discovering these blind spots, which are usually just more sensations arising and passing away. So, just more stuff to become aware of, to be mindful of, to experience as being groundless as well. So yeah, the more you can do that and actually apply the method, to actually just keep on doing whatever brought you to that place, just broaden its scope to look for, okay, well, what am I not seeing it? What is still solidified here through
Hmm.
my way of looking? The smoother and quicker the journey will go, but it's still a process of figuring out how to do that.
It seems like a lot of people get frustrated, especially coming off of that spiritual high, wondering why their experience has changed and if they're doing something wrong. And then this desire to get back to that place is actually an impediment to their progress and insight. So when the insight progresses, if you are able to stay with your sensate experience, there kind of comes a special stage in which you become equanimous about what is arising and what is passing away and its relationship to you. And if you can be equanimous through that phase, you can have cessation experiences. If you don't remain equanimous through that stage, my understanding of it, at least how Ingram talks about it, is that you kind of go back to the start of the dark night or the difficult period, and you have to go through that trajectory again and again until you're able to retain the requisite level of equanimity to get you past that hump. Would that be correct in your own personal experience?
I would say yes, you can experience it like that. In my personal experience, it was a little bit different because I learned about many of these phases that you go through and stages only in retrospect. So I have to like, this is this was this experience, and so it all unfolded a little bit more. Kind of calmly for me. It
Mm,
wasn't like this pronounced, these different phases. It was like, even probably because I was blind to them to a certain degree. And this again, where like intention and expectation comes in when you expect certain big things to happen, probably you're looking for those parts and therefore giving them more energy and they get more pronounced. um, because yeah, you can move through that, through those cycles, and even have cessations rather unconsciously. So it can
hmm.
happen even earlier, but then you only recognize that in retrospect. And over time this becomes more and more visible, the parts of it. um, yeah, that's what it's has unfolded for me, and is also what you read when you have different schools describing how you move through these experiences according to their models. Some make this more distinctions, more stages, and more clarity on those, whereas others basically just say sit and watch your breath, and that's all they give you. Like in some Zen traditions, where it's like there is no concept around, okay, you go through this and then that and then this. And yeah, there's a whole variety of teachings, and how in depth they are on these different experiences.
Yeah, I would want to reiterate that some people can go through these, what for some people are difficult stages, challenging stages, and they can go through it very smoothly,
Mm.
without much struggle or maybe even noticing. So, can we talk a little bit about? We've got, you get past, at least in this model that we're using with Ingram's model he put forward, you get past this stage of equanimity, and then there is the possibility of experiencing a cessation. What is a cessation, and what is the value of a cessation in the spiritual journey?
Mm. Yeah, I have to say I'm still at the point where I'm working out for myself how to approach these in a predictable way, and really figure out or get clarity on what happens leading up to them and following. So I can't speak with much authority on this. So everything that I know is also mostly I've gathered through reading and then retrospectively seeing, okay, this was what I experienced. This matches these and these descriptions. But yeah, as I'm also still at the stage where I'm developing the ability to go also through the jhanas, predictably working out these different abilities to put the right ingredients in there, um, I'm hopefully able to access or to get to cessation um, more predictably in the future. So um, that's what I want to leave this as an answer to your question.
Okay. So for the experiences of cessation that you have had, well, I'm assuming that you have had these
Mhm.
experiences, if not predictably. Um, can you? And I know I'm kind of throwing you throwing you like a little curveball here, but can you describe them?
Mhm.
Um, what you do know of them leading up, the experience itself, which ironically should not be any experience, and what the after effect was for you.
Yeah, you the way a cessation is unfolding is usually very rapidly. When you know it's going to happen, it kind of already has happened in a sense. So when you are in the right, the conditions are ripe, and everything is there, it kind of can feel like the whole world is going to be instantly ripped away. Like everything that's maybe still there, any sense of solidity that you are still experiencing, it just goes goes away. And then it's like there's just emptiness without any reference points. So there is no space, no time, and you only make sense of it afterwards. It's like, oh my God, there was something big. There was something in my experience that seemed like a blank, but you can't put any word on it. It's just empty, and maybe you have to laugh. You have to, usually, it has a ripple down effect. This emptiness, it's something unimaginably, undescribable, huge, or infinite, even though these words only make sense in terms of time and space. But um, yeah, it leaves a noticeable after effect. Um, and a cessation can unfold in three different ways. So usually it is entered through either no self, where this is also my experience, where it's like there's from the inside out, it feels like there's nothing. It's like, oh, there's no self, and this is projected kind of onto everything. And if there's no self, then there's nothing. And that's kind of how it goes. Like um, every sense of self, everything that you see, that you have projected a sense of self on, is eradicated. But then there's also um, the door to enter cessation, which I haven't experienced, which is through suffering, where it feels like it's described like it's suffering is kind of going very quickly to infinite in a fraction of a second, and this is like too much for reality, kind of, and then it goes out, um, and yeah, the cessation happens. And the third one I have to pull from my mind. Do you know it right
Is
now?
that the um, change? Like, so there's no, these are supposed to be the three characteristics of no self, um, dukkha, or not dissatisfaction, and change,
Mm,
anatta, I believe.
yeah, or impermanence. Yeah.
Impermanence, yeah.
Yeah, that actually makes sense. Maybe they are related. Maybe I haven't made that connection yet. That you enter cessation through these three characteristics. Yeah, maybe that makes sense to why they are three. Could be.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
in the Theravada model, there's it's called a four path model of the stream winner, once returner, non returner, and arhat. and each stage is supposed to correspond to certain psychological changes. Having gone through the experience of cessation, do you feel like there's a difference of in Lauritz before and after that experience?
Yeah, it usually it tends to decrease those um, aspects that are reduced throughout the four path. So you
Hmm.
have, and I only can tell that through my own experience in retrospect because I hadn't had these concepts at the time. So I don't know clearly, okay, one cessation caused these and these attachments to fall away. But usually it's through several cessations you are reducing um, the illusory nature that you are creating before you engage in the past. So when you are
Hmm.
stream enterer, you have eliminated certain kinds of beliefs or illusions that you were believing as true before, and so yeah, those tend to get reduced with each cessation. It's my experience, and
Yeah.
I think it's also, as you mentioned, Daniel Ingram is one who writes very um, in detail about these things. So if someone wants to know about, okay, where am I on the path to judge? Okay, where is this going? What's coming next? Or it's really helpful to read his book and get some ideas about that. But also, as I said earlier, not everyone has to experience the path to such a degree of detailed and clarity, and also kind of the amplitude of the experiences. I feel
Hmm.
is going different for every person.
Would you also say that people can experience cessations without even knowing that they've had that experience as well?
Yeah, definitely, because you have to know what it is in order to like conceptualize it. Otherwise, you would just, oh, there was something strange. Don't know what happened. Something like this. You
Yeah.
will probably tend to overlook it, but also I think they are very rare if you are not consciously engaging in certain type of practices like
Okay.
meditation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we are coming up on the 2 hour mark, and I feel like I could speak with you for another 2 hours
Yeah.
on topics. So maybe we can do a round two. That would be really cool. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or point people in the right direction, or maybe something we missed that maybe we should talk about next time, perhaps? Or
No, it doesn't really come to mind right now. Just generally, yeah, people can, if they want to have some idea of what my teachings are about or what I share, what my experience was like, they can go to my YouTube channel, check out my videos there. Also to my website, it's linked under each video. Um, and yeah, just my hope is to just share the beauty that I experienced coming from these practices. So, everyone who's new to meditation, I would just encourage, build the habit, get started. 10 minutes a day is enough to build the habit, to get into it. And then, yeah, see where it takes you from there. And if your interest grows, and also a lot of reading usually is required to understand well and to keep the motivation growing, also on a conceptual basis. Yeah, and just it's a beautiful journey to be on, even though maybe sometimes it feels you're giving a lot, you're spending a lot of energy into it and not getting all of that back. That's what it can feel like in the beginning. But there will be a point where meditation will become kind of your center point of attention in life, where it's like, okay, this is, yeah, there are all these other things and they are cool too and important on a certain level, and you keep doing them, but meditation is like why you are doing all the rest, kind of, um,
yeah,
to a degree, to a point, and then it will also drop away again in a beautiful way. Yeah, so it's a beautiful journey to be on.
I I once had a conversation with my wife, and she asked me, what's the most important thing in my life? And the standard answer is usually family and friends and stuff. But I told her no, it's my spirituality, because that informs my relationships with my family and friends. And I feel like when I pursue these things, I'm able to love more, be more present, really get the most out of my experience and my relationships. So I totally see that it does become the center from which everything else emanates from. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's definitely because it's that one thing that leads to wholeness, to oneness, where, oh, yeah, you see, this led to that. It's cause and effect. And when you see that, what great effect a meditation has, you value it
yeah,
highly. And then, yeah, as you said, the rest of the life is informed from that. Yeah, so
yeah.
thank you for the interview. And yeah, we can definitely do another one in the future.
Well, thank you for your time, Lauritz. Really appreciate
Yeah.
it.
Bye.
Bye.